The birthday cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its 43 candles melted into waxy puddles. Marcus stared at the divorce papers scattered across the mahogany dining table, his wife's signature still wet with ink. Through the bay window of their Denver home, snowflakes drifted past the streetlights like ash from a funeral pyre. Victoria stood by the marble fireplace, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood as she paced, her blonde hair catching the amber glow of the flames. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've already spoken to my attorney, she said, her voice sharp as winter wind. You'll get what's fair, Marcus, nothing more. Her emerald dress, the same one he'd bought her for their anniversary last year, seemed to mock him now. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor, her manicured nails drumming against its surface. The house, the cars, the business accounts, I know exactly what we have. Marcus remained silent, his weathered hands folded on the table. 20 years of marriage, reduced to legal documents and calculated divisions. He thought of the mornings they'd shared coffee in this very kitchen, planning their future, dreaming of children who never came. Now, those dreams lay shattered like the champagne flute Victoria had thrown against the wall when he'd questioned her sudden need for independence. "Happy birthday to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Victoria's laugh was cold, brittle. "Oh, please, drop the wounded husband act. We both know this marriage has been dead for years." She moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I'm just finally doing something about it." Marcus studied her profile, noting the expensive jewelry he'd never seen before, the subtle changes in her appearance that spoke of secrets kept and lies told. The woman he'd fallen in love with at the University of Colorado seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone calculating and cruel. He'd built everything for her, sacrificed his own dreams of becoming an architect to take over his father's construction company, working 18-hour days to give her the life she demanded. "The papers are straightforward," Victoria continued, turning back to face him. 50-50 split of marital assets. I've been generous, considering. Her smile was razor-thin. "My lawyer assures me it's all quite standard." The wind howled through the Colorado mountains as Marcus sat in his truck outside Richardson Financial Services, the manila envelope containing Victoria's demands heavy in his lap. 3 weeks had passed since that disastrous birthday, 3 weeks of sleeping in the guest room while his wife paraded through their home like a conquering general, cataloging assets and making plans. The late February cold seeped through the truck's windows, but Marcus barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the meeting ahead. Harold Richardson had been his financial advisor for 15 years, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to see through corporate smokescreens. His office occupied the 3rd floor of a modest brick building in downtown Denver, far from the gleaming towers where Victoria's shark-like attorney held court. Marcus had called him the day after the divorce papers appeared, needing someone he could trust to help navigate the treacherous waters ahead. The elevator climbed slowly, each floor marked by a soft ding that echoed in the narrow shaft. Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed during the early days of his business, when every meeting could make or break his company. The fabric felt foreign beneath his fingers, a reminder of the man he'd become to please Victoria, trading his flannel shirts and work boots for suits and Italian leather. "Marcus," Harold greeted him warmly as he entered the office. The older man rose from behind his desk, extending a firm handshake. "I have to say, I was surprised by your call. Divorce proceedings aren't usually my area of expertise." "I need someone I trust," Marcus replied, settling into the leather chair across from Harold's desk. The office smelled of old books and coffee, a comforting contrast to the sterile perfection of his home. "Victoria's attorney is aggressive. I need to understand my options." Harold nodded, his gray hair catching the afternoon light filtering through the window. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over. Her demands are substantial, but not unreasonable, given Colorado's equitable distribution laws." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "However, I noticed something interesting in your financial history." Marcus straightened, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "The account with Mountain West Bank, the one you opened 6 months after your marriage." Harold pulled a folder from his desk drawer, its contents neatly organized with colored tabs. "You've been making regular deposits for 20 years, but it's not listed among the marital assets in Victoria's filing." The account. Marcus had almost forgotten about it, buried beneath years of joint finances and shared responsibilities. It had started small, just a few $100s skimmed from his paychecks, money Victoria never knew existed. Over the years, as his business grew and prospered, those deposits had increased. The account had become his safety net, a hedge against uncertainty he'd never fully understood until now. "She doesn't know about it," Marcus said quietly. "I opened it as a business emergency fund, separate from our joint accounts. The statements go to my office." Harold's eyebrows raised slightly. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus swallowed hard. $430,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Harold leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "That's a significant sum, Marcus. Technically, any assets acquired during the marriage are subject to division, regardless of whose name is on the account." "But she doesn't know about it," Marcus repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Her lawyers base their calculations on what they think we have. They've been thorough, but they missed this." "The question is," Harold said carefully, "what do you want with this information?" Marcus stared out the window at the snow-capped peaks in the distance, remembering the young man who'd climbed those mountains with Victoria during their courtship. She'd seemed different then, full of laughter and dreams that matched his own. But that woman had vanished gradually, replaced by someone who valued possessions over people, status over substance. "I'd built everything for her," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "Worked 16-hour days, missed family gatherings, sacrificed my health to give her everything she wanted. And now she wants to walk away with half of everything, plus alimony, because she's decided she's unhappy." "The papers are straightforward," Victoria continued, turning back to face him. 50-50 split of marital assets. I've been generous, considering." Her smile was razor-thin. "My lawyer assures me it's all quite standard." The wind howled through the Colorado mountains as Marcus sat in his truck outside Richardson Financial Services, the manila envelope containing Victoria's demands heavy in his lap. 3 weeks had passed since that disastrous birthday, 3 weeks of sleeping in the guest room while his wife paraded through their home like a conquering general, cataloging assets and making plans. The late February cold seeped through the truck's windows, but Marcus barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the meeting ahead. Harold Richardson had been his financial advisor for 15 years, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to see through corporate smokescreens. His office occupied the 3rd floor of a modest brick building in downtown Denver, far from the gleaming towers where Victoria's shark-like attorney held court. Marcus had called him the day after the divorce papers appeared, needing someone he could trust to help navigate the treacherous waters ahead. The elevator climbed slowly, each floor marked by a soft ding that echoed in the narrow shaft. Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed during the early days of his business, when every meeting could make or break his company. The fabric felt foreign beneath his fingers, a reminder of the man he'd become to please Victoria, trading his flannel shirts and work boots for suits and Italian leather. "Marcus," Harold greeted him warmly as he entered the office. The older man rose from behind his desk, extending a firm handshake. "I have to say, I was surprised by your call. Divorce proceedings aren't usually my area of expertise." "I need someone I trust," Marcus replied, settling into the leather chair across from Harold's desk. The office smelled of old books and coffee, a comforting contrast to the sterile perfection of his home. "Victoria's attorney is aggressive. I need to understand my options." Harold nodded, his gray hair catching the afternoon light filtering through the window. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over. Her demands are substantial, but not unreasonable, given Colorado's equitable distribution laws." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "However, I noticed something interesting in your financial history." Marcus straightened, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "The account with Mountain West Bank, the one you opened 6 months after your marriage." Harold pulled a folder from his desk drawer, its contents neatly organized with colored tabs. "You've been making regular deposits for 20 years, but it's not listed among the marital assets in Victoria's filing." The account. Marcus had almost forgotten about it, buried beneath years of joint finances and shared responsibilities. It had started small, just a few $100s skimmed from his paychecks, money Victoria never knew existed. Over the years, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The law assumes both parties are honest about their assets, but Victoria's been lying about other things. I've seen credit card statements for accounts I didn't know existed, jewelry I never bought her, expenses that don't add up. Are you suggesting your wife has been hiding assets as well? Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled receipt he'd found in Victoria's purse. $5,000 at Cartier last month, paid for with a credit card I've never seen. He placed it on Harold's desk. "There's more, a lot more." Harold examined the receipt, his expression thoughtful. "If both parties are concealing assets, it changes the dynamic considerably. But you'd need proof, documentation that would hold up in court." "What if I don't want it to go to court?" Marcus asked. "What if I want to handle this differently?" The older man leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" Marcus felt something shift inside him, a resolve he hadn't experienced since his father's death 10 years ago. "I'm proposing we let Victoria believe she's smarter than everyone else in the room. Let her think she's getting away with something, and then we show her what real consequences look like." Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face. "You're talking about a dangerous game. If this backfires, you could lose everything." "I've already lost everything that mattered," Marcus replied. "My wife, my trust, my faith in the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. At least this way, I might preserve my dignity." The meeting continued for another hour, Harold outlining the legal implications and potential risks of Marcus's approach. But Marcus's mind was already moving ahead, formulating a plan that would require patience, precision, and a willingness to play by Victoria's rules until the moment came to change the game entirely. As he left the building, the Denver skyline stretched before him, its glass towers gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Victoria was probably at the country club now, telling her friends about the generous settlement she was going to receive, painting herself as the victim of a loveless marriage. Let her believe that, Marcus thought. Let her believe she was in control. He drove home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, past the houses where they'd attended dinner parties and barbecues, where they'd played the role of the successful couple. The facade had been convincing, even to him at times. But facades had a way of crumbling when the foundation beneath them proved to be built on lies. The house was dark when he arrived, Victoria's car absent from the circular driveway. She'd been staying out later recently, claiming to be with her sister or at book club meetings that seemed to run well past midnight. Marcus didn't care anymore where she went or who she was with. He had work to do. In his home office, a room Victoria rarely entered, Marcus pulled out his laptop and began making phone calls. The first was to Jerry Kowalski, a private investigator he'd used occasionally for background checks on potential business partners. Jerry had retired from the Denver Police Department after 25 years, but his network of contacts remained intact. "Marcus," Jerry's gravelly voice came through the phone. "Been a while. What can I do for you?" "I need information on someone," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "Someone close to home? How close?" "My wife." Jerry was quiet for a moment. "That's messy territory, friend. You sure you want to go down that road?" Marcus looked at the framed photo on his desk, taken during their honeymoon in Tuscany. Victoria's smile seemed genuine in the picture, her hand resting lovingly on his chest as they stood overlooking a vineyard. He wondered when that woman had died and been replaced by the stranger who now shared his home. "I'm sure," he said. "She's been hiding financial activity, and I suspect there's more. I need to know everything." "All right," Jerry sighed, "but this stays between us. If anyone asks, we never had this conversation." "Understood. Give me a week. I'll see what I can dig up." Marcus hung up and leaned back in his leather chair, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy blanket. He was crossing a line, moving from passive victim to active participant in what was becoming more than just a divorce. But Victoria had drawn first blood on his birthday, showing him exactly how little their 20 years together had meant to her. He opened his laptop and logged into the Mountain West Bank website, staring at the account balance that represented 2 decades of careful planning and sacrifice. $430,000. Victoria had demanded half of everything, but she'd made a critical error in assuming she knew what everything was. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman who prided herself on attention to detail, who could spot a crooked picture frame from across a room, had missed the most significant detail of all. Her greed had blinded her to the possibility that her methodical, predictable husband might have secrets of his own. Marcus began typing, creating a detailed inventory of every asset, every account, every piece of property they owned. He worked methodically, the same way he approached construction projects, building his case brick by brick. By the time Victoria's car pulled into the driveway at nearly midnight, he had the foundation of a plan that would either save him or destroy them both. He closed the laptop and headed upstairs, passing Victoria in the hallway. She smelled of expensive perfume and something else, something that confirmed what he'd already suspected but had been too afraid to confront. She didn't speak to him, didn't even acknowledge his presence as she disappeared into their bedroom, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Marcus settled into the guest room that had become his sanctuary, staring at the ceiling as snow began to fall outside the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new pieces of the puzzle that was his disintegrating marriage. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, he felt something that had been absent since his birthday disaster: hope. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, Denver wrapped in a blanket of fresh snow that muffled the usual sounds of traffic and construction. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, watching Victoria scrape ice from her BMW's windshield with angry, efficient movements. She wore the fur coat he bought her for Christmas, its dark color making her seem like a shadow against the white landscape. She was meeting her attorney today, he knew, because she'd made no effort to hide her calendar or her intentions. Victoria had always been direct about getting what she wanted, a quality he'd once admired but now saw as a weakness. Her predictability was becoming a weapon he could use against her. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jerry. "Coffee? Usual place?" Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, telling Victoria he had a job site to visit. She barely looked up from her phone, probably texting her lawyer or whoever else had become more important than the man she'd promised to love and honor. The Mountain View Diner sat on the edge of downtown Denver, a relic from the 1950s that served strong coffee and minded its own business. Jerry Kowalski occupied a corner booth, his weathered face partially hidden behind a copy of the Denver Post. He looked up as Marcus approached, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "You look like hell," Jerry said without preamble. "Feel worse," Marcus replied, sliding into the opposite seat. The vinyl was cracked but comfortable, worn smooth by decades of conversations, both mundane and momentous. Jerry signaled the waitress for coffee, waiting until she'd filled both their cups before speaking again. "I did some preliminary digging on your wife, found a few interesting things." Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm mug, steadying himself for whatever was coming. "Tell me." "She's been busy," Jerry said, pulling a manila folder from his coat. 3 credit cards in her name only, all opened within the last 6 months. Combined limit of $60,000, and she's maxed out 2 of them. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Marcus's mouth. $60,000? That's just the beginning. Jerry opened a folder, revealing bank statements and credit reports. She's also been receiving deposits into a personal account, regular amounts, every 2 weeks, $1,500 each time. Marcus felt his stomach drop. From where? That's where it gets interesting. The deposits are coming from a company called Alpine Marketing Solutions. Ever heard of it? No. Marcus studied the bank statements, noting the dates and amounts. The pattern was clear, methodical. What kind of company is it? Jerry's expression darkened. It's a shell company, registered in Delaware, but the checks are signed by someone named David Hawthorne. Ring any bells? The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. David Hawthorne was Victoria's former colleague from her brief stint in real estate, a smooth-talking man with expensive suits and a reputation for bending rules. Marcus had met him at a few industry events, noting the way Victoria laughed too loudly at his jokes and found excuses to touch his arm during conversations. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Based on these records, about 8 months, maybe longer if they were using cash before setting up the formal arrangement. 8 months. That meant it had started before Victoria filed for divorce, before her sudden desire for independence, before her claims of being trapped in an unhappy marriage. She'd been planning her exit strategy while still sharing his bed, still accepting his gifts, still playing the role of devoted wife. "There's more," Jerry continued. "I tracked Hawthorne's company to an office building in Cherry Creek, very upscale, very expensive. But here's the thing, Alpine Marketing doesn't seem to do any actual marketing. No clients, no contracts, no legitimate business activity that I can find." Marcus nodded, the pieces clicking into place. "It's a front." "That's my guess. And if your wife is receiving regular payments from a front company, that suggests she's providing some kind of service in return. The question is, what kind of service?" The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus had suspected infidelity, but evidence of financial fraud added a new dimension to Victoria's betrayal. She wasn't just cheating on their marriage, she was stealing from it while building a future with another man. "I need more," Marcus said. "Everything you can find. Phone records, travel records, anything that shows the scope of what they're doing." Jerry closed the folder and leaned back in his seat. "This is going to get expensive, Marcus, and ugly. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about Victoria's cold smile as she'd handed him the divorce papers, her casual dismissal of 20 years of marriage, her certainty that she held all the cards. How ugly? Depends on how deep this goes. If Hawthorne's company is involved in anything illegal, your wife could be looking at criminal charges, money laundering, fraud, conspiracy. Even if it's just an affair financed through creative accounting, it's still going to destroy her reputation and her divorce settlement. "Good," Marcus said, surprising himself with the venom in his voice. "She destroyed our marriage. Fair's fair." Jerry studied him for a long moment. "You're not the same guy who used to worry about overcharging clients by $50. This thing is changing you." Maybe it needed to. Marcus pulled out his wallet and placed $200 on the table. "Find everything, Jerry, and keep receipts. I have a feeling I'm going to need them for court." As he drove home through the snowy streets, Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and disgust. He'd been right to suspect Victoria of deception, but knowing the truth felt like swallowing poison. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd built a life with, had been systematically betraying him for months while planning her escape. But she'd made a critical error in assuming he was too naive or too trusting to fight back. Victoria saw him as predictable, reliable Marcus who always played by the rules and never made waves. That version of himself was about to disappear, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. His phone rang as he pulled into the driveway. Harold Richardson's name appeared on the screen. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Harold said without preamble. "About your hidden account and your wife's potential financial improprieties. I may have some advice that could help you." "I'm listening." "Don't do anything yet. Let her make the first move in court. Let her present her version of your financial situation. Give her enough rope to hang herself with, and then we'll show the judge exactly what kind of person she really is." Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. "How long do you think we'll need?" A month, maybe 2. Long enough for her to commit to her lies and sworn testimony. Long enough for her to believe she's already won. And then? Then we destroy her credibility so thoroughly that she'll be lucky to walk away with anything at all. Marcus hung up and sat in his truck for a moment, watching snow collect on the windshield. Through the living room window, he could see Victoria pacing back and forth, probably practicing her victim speech for her attorney. She had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her, that the quiet, dependable husband she'd taken for granted was about to become her worst nightmare. He thought about the younger man he'd been when they met, full of dreams and ambitions that had gradually been reshaped to accommodate Victoria's vision of their future. That man might have forgiven this betrayal, might have tried to save a marriage that was already dead. But that man was gone, buried beneath 20 years of compromise and disappointment. Marcus got out of the truck and walked toward the house, his footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. Victoria glanced up as he entered, her expression guarded but not particularly concerned. She still saw him as harmless, still believed she was the smartest person in the room. That belief was going to cost her everything. The snow had stopped falling by the time Marcus received Jerry's second report, but the chill in the air seemed to seep deeper into his bones with each revelation. 3 weeks had passed since their meeting at the diner. 3 weeks of Victoria maintaining her facade of injured innocence while secretly orchestrating what Marcus now understood to be an elaborate financial scheme. Jerry's latest findings painted a picture that was both more complex and more damning than Marcus had initially imagined. David Hawthorne's shell company was just the tip of an iceberg that included forged documents, manipulated tax returns, and a network of fake businesses designed to hide the true source and destination of significant amounts of money. Marcus sat in his office after hours, the construction company's headquarters quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the interstate. The building smelled of sawdust and coffee, familiar scents that grounded him as he absorbed the implications of Jerry's investigation. The files spread across his desk told a story of systematic betrayal that went far beyond a simple affair. Victoria and Hawthorne had been siphoning money from multiple sources, including several of Hawthorne's legitimate business clients who apparently had no idea their marketing consultant was using their accounts as a personal ATM. But the most shocking discovery was closer to home. Victoria had been systematically stealing from Marcus's own company, using her access to his office and his trust in her to forge invoices and redirect payments. The amounts were small enough to escape notice during routine bookkeeping, but over the course of 18 months, they totaled nearly $90,000. Marcus felt a rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a white-hot fury that made his hands shake as he held the evidence of his wife's theft. She hadn't just been unfaithful, she'd been robbing him blind while planning her escape. Every kiss, every shared meal, every moment of supposed intimacy had been a lie designed to keep him from discovering her crimes. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Having dinner with Sarah, don't wait up." Sarah was Victoria's sister, a divorced real estate agent who lived in Aspen and rarely visited Denver. Marcus knew without checking that Sarah was probably at home, completely unaware that her name was being used as cover for another clandestine meeting with Hawthorne. The lies had become so casual, so effortless, that Victoria no longer even bothered to make them convincing. She assumed Marcus was too trusting, too naive, or too weak to question her stories. That assumption was about to prove catastrophic. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Jerry's number. The private investigator answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and late nights. "I was wondering when you'd call. You've had time to digest the report?" "More than enough time." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed photo of Victoria that still sat on his desk. Her smile seemed mocking now, a reminder of how thoroughly she'd deceived him. "What's our next move?" "That depends on how far you want to take this. We have enough evidence to send both of them to prison, but once we involve law enforcement, you lose control of the situation." Marcus considered this. Part of him wanted to see Victoria in handcuffs, wanted to watch her perfect facade crumble in front of news cameras and judgmental neighbors. But another part, the part that had learned patience and strategy from 20 years of running a business, wanted something more personal. "What if we don't involve the police yet?" Marcus asked. "What if we use what we know to control the divorce proceedings?" "That's risky territory," Jerry warned. "You're talking about extortion, potentially. Even if she's guilty as hell, blackmail is still blackmail." "Not blackmail," Marcus said slowly, the plan crystallizing in his mind. "Justice. She wants to divide our assets 50-50 based on what she thinks we have. But she's been stealing from me for over a year, and she's been hiding income from her criminal activities. In a fair division, she should get nothing." Jerry was quiet for a moment. "You want to expose her in court. I want to destroy her credibility so completely that no judge in Colorado would award her a dime." Marcus stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. "But first, I want her to commit to her lies under oath. I want her to dig her hole so deep that she can't climb out." "That's going to require some acting on your part. You'll need to play the devastated husband, make her think she's winning." Marcus smiled grimly. "I've been playing that role for weeks already. A few more months won't kill me." They talked for another hour, refining the strategy and identifying the key pieces of evidence they would need in court. Jerry had contacts in the forensic accounting field who could trace every stolen dollar and document every fraudulent transaction. The case they were building would be airtight, unbreakable, and absolutely devastating to Victoria's claims of victimhood. But the most important element of their plan was timing. They needed to let Victoria and her attorney present their version of the marital assets, let them file sworn statements about income and expenses, let them commit to a narrative that Marcus could then systematically demolish with hard evidence. As Marcus drove home through the empty streets of Denver, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for months. The man who had passively accepted Victoria's demands, who had meekly agreed to marriage counseling and temporary separations, was gone. In his place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The house was dark when he arrived, Victoria's absence confirmed by the empty garage and the lack of any sign that she'd been home since morning. Marcus wondered if she was with Hawthorne now, planning their future together on money stolen from the husband she'd betrayed. The thought should have hurt, but instead it only strengthened his resolve. He went to his office and opened his laptop, accessing the Mountain West bank account that Victoria still didn't know existed. The balance had grown to $437,000, a nest egg that represented 20 years of careful planning and sacrifice. Soon, it would represent something else entirely, the foundation of his new life, built on the ashes of Victoria's destroyed dreams. Marcus began transferring money from the hidden account to a new one at a different bank, one located in a jurisdiction that would make it difficult for Victoria's attorneys to access even if they discovered its existence. He moved the funds in small increments, amounts that wouldn't trigger federal reporting requirements or raise red flags with banking authorities. Each transfer felt like a small victory, a reclamation of power that Victoria had systematically stripped away through months of lies and manipulation. She wanted to play games with hidden assets and secret accounts. Marcus was about to show her how that game was really played. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Victoria was in the kitchen when Marcus came downstairs, something that hadn't happened in weeks. She was making coffee, her movements efficient and purposeful, wearing a silk robe that he'd never seen before. "We need to talk," she said without looking at him, her voice carrying a note of authority that immediately put Marcus on guard. "About what?" He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, noting that she'd only prepared enough for 1 cup. Even this small gesture was calculated, a reminder that she no longer considered his needs worth considering. Victoria turned to face him, her expression serious but not hostile. My attorney thinks we should try mediation before this goes to trial. It would be less expensive for both of us and more private. Marcus sipped his coffee, buying time while he processed this new information. Mediation would mean revealing assets earlier than planned, but it would also mean less formal discovery procedures and fewer opportunities for Jerry's evidence to surface unexpectedly. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "Last week you were talking about taking me for everything I was worth." A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or calculation, crossed Victoria's face. "I've been thinking about what's best for both of us. This has been hard enough without dragging it through the courts for months." Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the lie for what it was. Victoria's sudden interest in mediation had nothing to do with compassion or efficiency. Something had spooked her, possibly a conversation with Hawthorne about the risks of prolonged legal proceedings that might uncover their criminal activities. "I'm willing to consider it," Marcus said carefully, "but I'll need to discuss it with my attorney first." "Of course." Victoria's smile was warm but hollow, the practiced expression of someone who'd perfected the art of manipulation. "I just think we owe it to ourselves to try." As she left the kitchen, Marcus felt a familiar mixture of admiration and disgust for her ability to play whatever role the situation demanded. Even now, knowing what he knew about her crimes and betrayals, he could see why he'd fallen in love with her 20 years ago. The woman was a master performer, capable of projecting whatever emotion or motivation would best serve her purposes. But every performance has flaws, and Marcus was beginning to see the cracks in Victoria's facade. Her eagerness for mediation, her sudden return to playing the role of concerned wife, her careful avoidance of any discussion about finances or future plans, all of it pointed to someone who was feeling pressure from sources Marcus could only imagine. He called Harold Richardson as soon as Victoria left for her morning yoga class, another recent addition to her routine that Marcus suspected had nothing to do with physical fitness. "She wants mediation," Marcus told his attorney without preamble. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Interesting timing. Any idea what prompted this change of heart?" "I think she's scared. Jerry's investigation has been thorough enough that word might be getting back to her through Hawthorne's network. If they're worried about federal authorities getting involved, they might want to wrap up the divorce quickly and quietly." "That could work in our favor," Harold said thoughtfully. "Mediation proceedings are less formal, but they still require full financial disclosure from both parties. If she lies about her assets or income in mediation, it's just as legally binding as lying in court." Marcus smiled. "And just as prosecutable." "Exactly. Plus, mediation sessions are recorded and transcribed. Every false statement, every moment of perjury will be documented and available for use in criminal proceedings if necessary." They spent 30 minutes discussing strategy, Harold explaining the mediation process and the opportunities it would provide for exposing Victoria's deception. The key was to appear cooperative while methodically documenting every lie she told, building a case that would be impossible to refute when the time to reveal the truth. Marcus hung up feeling more confident than he had in weeks. Victoria thought she was maneuvering him into a position of weakness, using her apparent reasonableness to contrast with what she assumed would be his bitter resistance to compromise. She had no idea that every step she took was leading her deeper into a trap of her own making. The afternoon brought a phone call from Jerry with news that added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted situation. Hawthorne's shell company had received a large payment from an overseas account, money that appeared to be connected to a real estate development project in the Cayman Islands. "We're talking about serious money," Jerry explained. 7 figures, moved through a series of accounts designed to obscure its origin and destination. "If your wife is involved in this, she's not just stealing from local clients, she's part of an international money laundering operation." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "How certain are you about this?" "Certain enough to recommend we bring in federal authorities sooner rather than later. This kind of operation usually involves multiple criminal organizations, and the people running it don't take kindly to loose ends." The implication was clear. If Victoria and Hawthorne were involved in something this big, Marcus's plan for personal revenge might be putting him in danger from sources far more threatening than divorce attorneys and angry spouses. "How much time do we have?" asked. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be days. Depends on how closely they're being watched and whether anyone else has connected the dots between Hawthorne's company and the overseas money." Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and finality. "We accelerate everything. No more waiting for Victoria to commit to lies and mediation. We expose everything now, before this gets any more dangerous." "You're sure about that?" "Once we pull this trigger, there's no going back." "I'm sure." Marcus looked around his office, at the business he'd dealt through years of honest work and careful planning. He wouldn't let Victoria's crimes destroy everything he'd accomplished, and he wouldn't risk his own safety to satisfy a desire for elaborate revenge. "All right," Jerry said. "I'll contact my federal friends tomorrow morning. You should probably get yourself a criminal attorney, someone who can protect you if this thing goes sideways." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his carefully planned campaign of justice had just become something much more urgent and dangerous. Victoria's betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was potentially criminal on a scale that could destroy multiple lives and businesses. He spent the evening in his office, organizing the evidence Jerry had gathered and preparing for what was likely to be the most important week of his life. The hidden account at Mountain West Bank would soon become Exhibit A in a federal investigation, and the woman he'd once loved would become a target for law enforcement agencies with resources far beyond anything Marcus could have imagined. The irony wasn't lost on him that Victoria's greed had ultimately saved him from a fate much worse than divorce. If she hadn't pushed for a quick settlement, if she hadn't involved herself with criminals who operated on an international scale, Marcus might have spent years fighting a conventional divorce battle while unaware of the federal investigation that was closing in around his wife. Now, instead of being a victim of Victoria's deception, he would be a witness to her downfall. The birthday betrayal that had seemed like the worst moment of his life was about to become the moment that saved him from something truly catastrophic. Marcus closed his laptop and headed upstairs, pausing at the window to look out at the Denver skyline. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably with Hawthorne, planning their next move in a game they didn't realize was already over. Federal agents were building cases, tracking money transfers, and connecting dots that would soon form a picture that would destroy both of their lives. The guest room where Marcus had been sleeping felt less like exile now and more like sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring phone calls to attorneys and federal agents, formal statements and sworn affidavits, the beginning of the end of his marriage, and the start of something he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time since his birthday disaster, Marcus slept peacefully. Justice was coming, not through his own elaborate schemes, but through the inexorable machinery of federal law enforcement. Victoria's greed had finally led her to steal from the wrong people, and the consequences would be far more severe than anything Marcus could have devised on his own. The last thing he thought about before falling asleep was the hidden account that had started this whole journey. $437,000 that Victoria had never known existed, money that would soon be the foundation of a new life built on the ruins of her destroyed dreams. She'd wanted to take everything from him, but in the end, she'd given him the one thing he'd needed most: the knowledge that he was stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than she'd ever imagined. And that knowledge would serve him well in whatever came next. The morning sun streamed through the guest room window as Marcus prepared for what he knew would be one of the most important days of his life. Victoria had left early for what she claimed was a shopping trip with friends, but Marcus suspected she was meeting with Hawthorne to discuss their increasingly precarious situation. He dressed carefully in his best suit, the charcoal gray wool that Victoria had insisted he buy for important business meetings. The irony of wearing her choice of clothing to destroy her life wasn't lost on him, but it felt appropriate somehow. Everything about their marriage had been performance and deception. Today, he would give the performance of his lifetime. The federal building in downtown Denver was an imposing structure of glass and steel that reflected the morning sky like a mirror. Marcus had driven past it countless times over the years, never imagining that he would one day walk through its doors as a key witness in a federal investigation. Agent Sarah Chen was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that reminded him of the architects he'd worked with in his younger days. She led him to a conference room where Harold Richardson and another attorney, a specialist in federal criminal law named Robert Hayes, were already waiting. "Mr. Thompson," Agent Chen began, settling into a chair across from Marcus, "I understand you have information about financial crimes involving your wife and a man named David Hawthorne." Marcus nodded, pulling out the folders Jerry had prepared. "My wife has been stealing from my business and receiving payments from what I believe to be illegal activities. I have documentation going back 18 months." For the next 3 hours, Marcus laid out everything he knew about Victoria's crimes. Agent Chen listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting additional details. Harold and Robert Hayes interjected when necessary to protect Marcus's legal interests, but for the most part, the session was a straightforward recounting of facts and evidence. The federal investigation, Marcus learned, was much larger than he'd imagined. Hawthorne's organization was suspected of laundering money for several criminal enterprises, including drug trafficking operations and illegal gambling networks. Victoria's involvement had been detected during routine surveillance of Hawthorne's financial activities, but Marcus's evidence provided crucial details about the scope and timeline of their crimes. "We'll need you to wear a recording device during any future interactions with your wife," Agent Chen explained as the meeting concluded. "If she discusses her activities with Hawthorne or reveals information about money transfers, that testimony could be crucial in securing convictions." Marcus agreed without hesitation. The man who had once worried about eavesdropping on his wife's phone calls was now prepared to actively gather evidence for federal prosecutors. Victoria's betrayal had transformed him into someone he barely recognized, someone capable of calculated deception in service of justice. The recording device was smaller than Marcus had expected, no larger than a button, and designed to be sewn into the lining of his jacket. Agent Chen showed him how to activate and deactivate it, warning him about the legal implications of recording conversations without consent. "In Colorado, you're legally allowed to record conversations that you're a party to," she explained, "but be careful not to discuss the federal investigation or reveal that you're working with us. If your wife becomes suspicious, she might flee or destroy evidence." Marcus left the federal building feeling like he was living in someone else's life. The quiet construction company owner who had passively accepted his wife's demands had been replaced by an active participant in a federal investigation involving millions of dollars and multiple criminal organizations. He drove home through familiar streets that now seemed foreign and threatening. Victoria's car was in the driveway when he arrived, her presence adding a new layer of tension to what had once been his sanctuary. She was in the living room when he entered, sitting on the couch with her laptop open, typing furiously. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but not particularly suspicious. "How was your meeting with Harold?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. Marcus had told her he was discussing mediation procedures with his attorney, a lie that now felt prophetic given the morning's events. "Productive," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "He thinks mediation could work in our favor." Victoria's smile was genuine for the first time in weeks. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Marcus. We both deserve to move on with our lives." The recording device captured every word, every subtle inflection that revealed Victoria's confidence in her ability to manipulate the situation. Marcus found himself studying her face, looking for signs of the criminal who had systematically betrayed him for over a year. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do after the divorce is final?" he asked, genuinely curious about her plans. "I'm thinking about relocating," Victoria said, closing her laptop. "Maybe somewhere warmer. Colorado winters are getting harder to tolerate." Marcus nodded as if this was a reasonable response, but he recognized it for what it was, a carefully veiled admission that she was planning to flee the jurisdiction once she'd obtained her settlement.
Agent Chen had warned him that this was a common pattern among criminal defendants who sensed that law enforcement was closing in. They talked for another 20 minutes about mundane topics: the weather, home repairs that needed attention, mutual friends who had called to check on them during the divorce proceedings. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like a normal conversation between estranged spouses trying to maintain civility during a difficult process. But Marcus was acutely aware of the recording device documenting every word, building a case that would eventually destroy the woman sitting across from him. The strangeness of the situation was almost overwhelming. He was simultaneously playing the role of concerned husband while actively gathering evidence to send his wife to federal prison. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the sender's name, David. Her response was quick and cryptic. "Later tonight. Same place." "Work?" Marcus asked innocently. "Just a friend," Victoria replied, but her cheeks flushed slightly. Even now, caught in an elaborate web of criminal activity, she couldn't resist the small deception of hiding her affair. That evening, Marcus watched from his office window as Victoria left the house dressed in the expensive clothing that he now knew had been purchased with stolen money. The recording device was safely stored in his desk drawer, its contents ready to be delivered to Agent Chen the following morning.
He called Jerry to report on the day's events and coordinate the next phase of their investigation. The private investigator's contacts in federal law enforcement had confirmed that arrests were imminent, possibly within the next week. "They're moving fast because they're worried about flight risk," Jerry explained. "Hawthorne has connections in non-extradition countries, and your wife's recent interest in relocation suggests she might be planning to join him." Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he contemplated Victoria's imminent arrest. The woman he'd once loved was about to face consequences that would destroy her life and likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. But she'd made her choices, and those choices had led inevitably to this moment. The house felt different that night, charged with the electric tension of impending change. Marcus packed a bag with essential items, following Agent Chen's advice to be prepared for rapid developments that might require him to leave his home temporarily. As he folded clothes and gathered important documents, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a trusting husband blindsided by divorce papers on his birthday. Now he was a federal witness preparing to testify against his wife in what would likely be one of the largest financial crimes cases in Colorado history. The hidden account that had started as his secret weapon in a divorce battle had become evidence in a federal investigation. The $437,000 that Victoria had never known existed would now be scrutinized by federal prosecutors and forensic accountants. But it would ultimately remain his, untainted by her crimes. Marcus set his alarm for 5 a.m., knowing that the next day would bring phone calls from Agent Chen and possibly news of Victoria's arrest. He fell asleep thinking about the future that was finally within reach. A life free from deception and betrayal, built on the foundation of truth and justice that Victoria's crimes had inadvertently provided. The recording device on his desk contained hours of conversations that would help convict a woman who had systematically destroyed their marriage while stealing from the man who had loved her. Justice was coming, swift and final, and Marcus would be there to witness every moment of her downfall. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, jolting Marcus from the deepest sleep he'd experienced in months. Agent Chen's voice was crisp and professional, carrying news that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. "We're moving today," she said without preamble. "Hawthorne tried to flee the country last night. TSA flagged him at Denver International with a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands and $200,000 in cash. We arrested him 3 hours ago." Marcus sat up in bed, his mind immediately sharp despite the early hour. "What about Victoria?" "That's why I'm calling. We need you to act completely normal this morning. She doesn't know about Hawthorne's arrest yet, and we want to take her at home rather than risk a chase through the city." The weight of the moment settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. After weeks of planning and investigation, the endgame was finally here. "What do you need me to do?" "Make coffee, read the newspaper, Act like it's any other day. We'll be there at 8 a.m. sharp, and we need her to be relaxed and unsuspecting when we arrive." Marcus dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made him appear as unthreatening as possible. The recording device remained in his desk drawer, its work complete, but he carried a small backup transmitter that would allow Agent Chen's team to monitor any conversation with Victoria before the arrest. Victoria was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, wearing a silk robe he'd never seen before, and moving with the efficient grace of someone who had important plans. She barely looked up as he entered, her attention focused on her phone and a cup of expensive coffee that filled the room with an exotic aroma. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral as he poured himself coffee from the machine. "Morning," Victoria replied absently, her fingers dancing across her phone screen. She seemed distracted, almost agitated, and Marcus wondered if she'd been trying unsuccessfully to reach Hawthorne. Marcus settled at the kitchen table with the Denver Post, scanning headlines while covertly observing his wife's behavior. She kept checking her phone every few minutes, her expression growing more concerned with each failed attempt to make contact with her criminal partner. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, projecting the concern of a caring husband rather than a federal witness preparing to watch his wife's arrest. Victoria looked up sharply, her eyes searching his face for signs of suspicion or knowledge. "Just work stuff," she said, but her voice carried a tension that suggested otherwise. "David was supposed to call me about a project this morning." The casual mention of Hawthorne's first name sent a chill through Marcus. Even now, facing imminent arrest, Victoria couldn't resist the small cruelty of reminding her husband that another man was more important to her than their 20-year marriage. "I'm sure he'll call when he can," Marcus said, returning his attention to the newspaper. The sports section provided perfect cover for his surveillance, allowing him to monitor Victoria's increasing anxiety while appearing completely absorbed in basketball scores and trade rumors. At 7:50, Victoria's phone finally rang. Marcus watched her face transform from relief to confusion to barely concealed panic as she realized the caller wasn't Hawthorne, but someone else entirely, probably his attorney or a business associate with news of the arrest. "I have to go," Victoria said abruptly, ending the call and rushing toward the stairs. "At 8 in the morning?" Marcus asked, but Victoria was already gone, her footsteps echoing through the house as she raced to get dressed. Marcus remained at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading about the Denver Nuggets playoff prospects while listening to Victoria frantically moving around upstairs. Drawers slammed, hangers rattled, and he could hear the distinctive sound of luggage being pulled from the closet. She was preparing to run, just as Agent Chen had predicted. The phone call had apparently warned her that Hawthorne was in custody and that her own arrest was imminent. But she was already too late, trapped by her own arrogance and the federal agents who were probably already surrounding the house. Victoria reappeared in the kitchen at 7:58, dressed in traveling clothes and carrying a designer handbag that Marcus suspected contained more than the usual contents. Her face was pale but determined, the expression of someone who had gambled everything on a single play and was now facing the consequences. "I'm going out of town for a few days," she announced, her voice strained but attempting normalcy. "Family emergency." Marcus nodded sympathetically. Which family member? The question caught Victoria off guard, and Marcus could see her mind racing to construct a plausible lie. "My aunt in Phoenix," she said finally. "She's in the hospital." Marcus knew Victoria's aunt lived in Seattle and was in perfect health, having spoken to her just last week. But he simply nodded and wished Victoria a safe trip, playing his role to perfection as the doorbell rang with the precise timing of a Swiss timepiece. "I'll get it," Marcus said, rising from the table as Victoria's face went completely white. Agent Chen stood on the front porch with 3 other federal agents, all wearing tactical gear that left no doubt about their purpose. Behind them, Marcus could see additional agents positioned around the property, blocking every possible escape route. "Mrs. Victoria Thompson?" Agent Chen addressed Victoria, who had appeared in the doorway behind Marcus. "I'm Agent Chen with the FBI. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, fraud, and racketeering." Victoria's handbag slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the house. The mask of composed sophistication that she'd worn for 20 years finally cracked, revealing the desperate criminal beneath.
"This is a mistake," Victoria said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I don't know what you're talking about." Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs, her movement practiced and efficient. "You have the right to remain silent."
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the Miranda rights continued, Marcus watched his wife's world collapse in real time. The woman who had controlled every aspect of their marriage, who had manipulated him with such skill and precision, was reduced to a sobbing figure in handcuffs being led to a federal vehicle. "Marcus," Victoria called out as the agents guided her toward the door, "call my attorney. Tell him this is all a misunderstanding." Marcus met her eyes for what he knew would be the last time, and in that moment he saw recognition dawning in her expression. She understood, finally, that her quiet, predictable husband had outmaneuvered her completely, that every conversation over the past weeks had been recorded and analyzed by federal investigators. "I'll call Harold," Marcus said simply, and Victoria's face crumpled as she realized the full extent of her husband's betrayal. The house fell silent after the federal vehicles departed, leaving Marcus alone with the scattered remains of his marriage. Victoria's handbag lay open on the kitchen floor, its contents spilled across the tile. Makeup, breath mints, and 2 passports, one legitimate, one obviously forged with Victoria's photo, but a different name. Marcus called Harold Richardson to report the arrest and coordinate the legal response that would follow. The divorce proceedings would now take a dramatically different turn, with Victoria facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. "It's over," Harold said simply. "She'll be lucky to avoid 20 years, and any claim she might have had to marital assets just evaporated. The government will seize everything connected to her criminal activities." Marcus felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness as he hung up the phone. Justice had been served with surgical precision, but the cost had been the complete destruction of everything he'd believed about his marriage and his wife. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations, media attention, and phone calls from friends and colleagues who had seen Victoria's arrest reported in the local news. Marcus found himself thrust into the role of cooperating witness in a federal case that expanded far beyond his personal situation. The investigation revealed that Hawthorne's organization had laundered over $15 million through a network of shell companies and corrupt business relationships. Victoria's role had been more significant than Marcus had initially realized. She'd been the primary recruiter of legitimate businesses that could be used as fronts for money laundering operations. Jerry's investigation had uncovered only the surface of a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of participants. Victoria's theft from Marcus's construction company had been pocket change compared to the millions she'd helped steal from other victims. The Mountain West bank account that had started Marcus's journey toward the truth became a crucial piece of evidence in the federal case. The timing of his deposits, combined with Victoria's theft from his business, provided prosecutors with a clear timeline of her criminal activities. Marcus testified before a federal grand jury, recounting the months of deception and betrayal that had led to Victoria's arrest. The process was emotionally draining, but ultimately cathartic, allowing him to finally tell the complete truth about his marriage to people who would use that truth to ensure justice was served. Victoria's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would have reduced her sentence in exchange for cooperation against other members of the criminal organization. But the evidence against her was so overwhelming, and her role so central to the operation, that prosecutors had little incentive to offer significant concessions. The trial began 6 months after Victoria's arrest, held in the federal courthouse in downtown Denver. Marcus attended every day, sitting in the gallery as prosecutors methodically dismantled his wife's claims of innocence. The woman who took the stand bore little resemblance to the confident, manipulative person who had handed him divorce papers on his birthday. Victoria appeared diminished, her expensive clothes replaced by a conservative suit that couldn't disguise the toll that months in federal custody had taken on her appearance. Her testimony was a masterpiece of selective memory and calculated misdirection, but the recordings Marcus had made undermined every claim she made about her innocence. Agent Chen had done her work well, building a case that anticipated and countered every possible defense. Hawthorne, facing his own lengthy sentence, had agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced term. His testimony about Victoria's role in recruiting victims and laundering money was devastating, painting her as a willing and enthusiastic participant in crimes that had destroyed multiple lives. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Marcus could see her hands trembling as she realized that her gamble had failed completely. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later, giving Marcus time to prepare his victim impact statement. He spent weeks crafting words that would convey the depth of Victoria's betrayal without appearing vindictive or self-pitying. When the day finally arrived, Marcus stood before the federal judge and spoke about the 20 years of marriage that had been built on lies, the trust that had been systematically destroyed, and the business he'd nearly lost because of his wife's crimes. Victoria Thompson didn't just steal money, Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. She stole my faith in human nature, my ability to trust, and my belief that love and commitment meant something. The financial damage can be repaired, but the emotional damage will take years to heal. Victoria was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Marcus felt a sense of closure that had been missing from his life since that devastating birthday 6 months earlier. The civil divorce proceedings were concluded within weeks of Victoria's sentencing. With her criminal conviction on record, there was no dispute about asset division. Marcus retained everything that wasn't seized by federal authorities as proceeds of criminal activity. The house in Denver, free of Victoria's presence and the memories of her betrayal, became Marcus's sanctuary as he began rebuilding his life. He renovated the kitchen where she'd served him divorce papers, transforming it from a place of betrayal into a symbol of renewal. The construction company that Victoria had stolen from began to thrive as Marcus threw himself into work with renewed energy and purpose. The federal investigation had actually improved his reputation in the industry, as clients saw him as someone who had courageously cooperated with law enforcement to expose corruption. Harold Richardson became more than just an attorney. He became a friend who helped Marcus navigate the complex emotional terrain of life after betrayal. They met regularly for lunch, discussing business opportunities and personal growth with the easy camaraderie of men who had survived a crisis together. Jerry Kowalski remained a valuable ally, his investigation services now employed by Marcus to vet potential business partners and ensure that he never again fell victim to the kind of elaborate deception that Victoria had perpetrated. The Mountain West bank account, no longer hidden but now openly acknowledged as Marcus's personal savings, grew steadily as his business prospered. The money that had once been his secret weapon in a divorce battle became the foundation of a new life built on honesty and integrity. Marcus began dating again after 2 years, meeting women through business connections and social activities rather than the kind of calculated encounters that had characterized his relationship with Victoria. He was more cautious now, more aware of the signs of deception and manipulation, but also more confident in his ability to recognize genuine affection and commitment. The woman who eventually became his second wife was nothing like Victoria, a teacher named Sarah who valued honesty over luxury and found Marcus's straightforward nature refreshing after her own experience with deceptive partners. Their wedding was a small, intimate ceremony attended by close friends and family members who had supported Marcus through the darkest period of his life. Victoria's name rarely came up in conversation, and when it did, Marcus felt only a distant sadness for the woman who chose crime over love, deception over truth.
The anger and desire for revenge that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and that he had emerged from the experience stronger and wiser. The federal prison where Victoria was serving her sentence was located in Texas, far enough from Denver that Marcus never worried about accidental encounters with her family or friends. He received occasional updates about her status through legal channels, but he felt no desire to maintain any connection to his former life. Victoria had lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, her financial security, and any hope of rebuilding the relationships she had destroyed through her crimes. The woman who had been so confident in her ability to manipulate and control had been utterly defeated by the consequences of her own choices. Marcus's new life was built on foundations that Victoria had never understood or valued: honesty, integrity, hard work, and genuine human connection. Victoria's crimes had inadvertently given Marcus the greatest gift of all: the knowledge that he was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than he had ever imagined. The man who had been blindsided by divorce papers on his 43rd birthday had become someone who could face any challenge with confidence and integrity. As Marcus looked toward the future, he felt grateful for the painful lessons that Victoria's betrayal had